Hi, everyone. My name is Gregory Q. Jenkins. I am the founder and CEO of Quintasia Studios. This is the Quintasia Podcast. Welcome. Today, we have another special guest for you. This person came to our attention through one of our leadership team members, who sadly couldn't be with us today because he's a little under the weather. But nevertheless, the show must go on. And we're going to talk to you about a great organization, and I think you're going to enjoy our guest today. So just a little bit of a brief intro. So as you come across this podcast, normally you'll see we talk to people who are in the media and entertainment personalities. We also talk to people who are in the fight for social justice. Now, we think that there's a tie-in to this because this organization, we believe, is a great organization, and we're going to do more shows like this. So today we have with us Adina Lichtman from Knock Knock Give a Sock. And she's going to tell us about her organization and the work that they do. And you're going to see why it's important to you. You might be thinking, well, why is Quintasia Studios doing a show on this? But it all ties in. You know, everybody is part of this community that we're trying to build, and we think it's important. And we think the media actually has a role to play in this issue. And hopefully you will see that as you if you hang around and you listen. One quick note, please, if you listen to this podcast, whether you're coming across us through Facebook, YouTube, or if you're listening to the audio portion on Apple, Google, Spotify, or Amazon, please subscribe and be a part of the conversation. So without further ado, I wish to introduce to you Adina Lichtman. Welcome.
Welcome.
Hey, thank you for having me today. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you for being here. And so let's dive in. Why don't you tell us about your organization, which is called Knock Knock Give a Sock?
Yeah, I'm excited to. So I guess I'll start by taking you a couple years back when I was a sophomore in college. I was in school at NYU, so I was in New York City. And if anyone's ever been to New York City, I'm sure they've seen some of our neighbors on the street experiencing homelessness. And so one night I was giving out sandwiches with a couple of friends to our neighbors on the street. And one guy said to me, "Ma'am, it's so nice you're giving out sandwiches, but one thing we could actually really use are a pair of socks." So I went back to my dorm room, I opened my drawer, and I saw pink socks and polka dotted socks. And I have a size 6 foot, and they weren't going to fit my new friend Diego. So I decided at that point to knock on every door on my floor in my dorm room at the time and ask each person for one pair of socks. And in about 15 minutes, I got over 40 pairs of socks. Fast forward to my senior year of college, we had spread to over 20 college campuses and collected over 50,000 pairs of socks. At that point, I became a nonprofit totally by accident because my parents were like, "Adina, there are enough socks in the garage. You need to find another place to put them." So that meant I need to figure out how to get a warehouse space and be able to pay for it, which means I need to start raising money, which means people kept asking me. And then I started emailing some sock companies as well to match the donations that the students were giving us. And everyone was asking me, "Are you a 501c3? I was like, "A what?" I had no idea what a 501c3 was. Turns out it was a tax-exempt nonprofit organization so that people could get a tax write-off for their donations to me. And lucky enough, I have a sister who's a lawyer, so her law firm was able to help us obtain that 501c3 nonprofit status. So then by the time I was a senior in college, I joked that I kind of became the sock celebrity on campus. Some people were even calling me social entrepreneur, which, by the way, is the hardest word to spell. I didn't even think of myself as an entrepreneur at that point. I was like, this is just a cool project that took off a lot bigger than I ever expected. But because I kind of became the social entrepreneur on campus, I would be asked by different colleges, by different synagogue groups, by different church groups to actually come speak and share the story of Knock Knock Give a Sock and what it had become. And basically I would go and I would tell them the story, but I would also ask them all one question, actually two questions. And anyone who's listening today, I want you to think about the questions, okay? I would say, if you've ever, have you ever given money, food, or clothing to someone in need or put in a donation bin? And let me tell you, every single person in the room raised their hands. And then I would say, who here can tell me the name of one person experiencing homelessness? And it would be silent. Almost no one would raise their hand. And these were all the same people who were giving food, money, or clothing. But there was this disconnect between those who were giving and them actually knowing the people, right? Having that point of connection. And I'll take it a step further. We had on this liberal college campus, we're talking about NYU, the heart of the heart of the village, where people are super progressive, super careful about the way they speak. It's somehow, when it came to homelessness, a lot of those stereotypes and stigmas that we were taught to stomp out crept in. We would have college students saying, Adina, what you're doing is great, but aren't most people who are homeless choosing to be homeless? Or aren't most people who are homeless, drug addicts or alcoholics? Or don't many of them suffer from mental illness? Now, on college campus, we don't even use the word mental illness. We talk about mental health, mental wellness, mental well-being. So a lot of these stigmas kind of crept in. And I even remember I saw a sign on the subway that said, from a great organization that does a lot of work to help our neighbors. It said, come volunteer with us, feed the homeless. And I remember thinking, imagine if I, Adina, saw a sign that said, feed the Jews, right? Or someone saw a sign that said, feed the blacks, right? Like, you'd be like, what? How do we talk like that? You feed animals, you feed babies, like people who literally cannot feed themselves. Right? It's very infantilizing, but somehow when it comes to homelessness, again, kind of these sensitivities kind of fall out the window. And what I realized was, it's because there was a lack of connection. We're very quick to speak out for people who we know who have personally been affected by issues. But when we don't know somebody who's personally been affected, that sensitivity goes way down. And so I need to figure out a way to bring communities together. So my senior year of college, I decided to bring 50 of my college classmates and 50 people living in local shelters to have dinner side by side. Now, we had two rules. One, no one was allowed to sit next to someone who they knew before entering that room, so they had to sit next to someone new. And two, no one was allowed to serve one another. And by the end of that night, I had college students saying to me, Adina, we can't tell who's homeless and who's not. They were meeting moms who had 3 kids who couldn't afford childcare, dads who'd gotten out of prison, couldn't get jobs afterwards, people working minimum wage jobs, but that doesn't get you out of the shelter system. And also, a lot of these stigmas around homelessness were broken. For example, I'll give you 2 facts that most people don't know. In New York City alone, out of the entire population of people who are homeless, right? Only 5% of homelessness in New York City sleeps on the streets, which means 95% of our neighbors who are experiencing homelessness in New York City, we actually don't see, right? They're sleeping in shelters, they're sleeping in cars, we don't see them during the day. And to take that a step further, out of the 60,000 people who are homeless in New York City on a given night, 25,000 are children, meaning over 1/3 of that population is children. But I guarantee you walk into any room and you ask a group of students, hey, what does someone who's homeless look like? You're not going to hear student. You're not going to hear single mom. You're not going to hear, the guy working at the cashier who's getting minimum wage, right? You're going to get that stereotype of the guy with the cardboard sign, with the long beard, with the long hair. So now homelessness had a name and a face and a story. And when Knock Knock Give a Sock was just an organization collecting socks, it was going to stay a college project. It was after this dinner that I realized I wanted this to be my career, but I wanted to do this in the corporate space. So who the heck was going to listen to me, this little college student saying like, hey, JP Morgan, we want to do a meet your neighbors dinner with your office. Oh, and we want to bring your employees and people living in shelters to have dinner side by side. and let's do it in your offices, right? Like, what? Are you insane? So that's when I realized we had to get a little sneaky, a little, we had to have some tact when we did it. My parents said I finally used manipulation for good, because what we would do is our mission became humanizing homelessness one sock at a time by turning transactions into interactions. So we would engage big companies like JP Morgan, Salesforce, WeWork. We would get these companies to do a sock drive in their office. And then after they did a sock drive, we would then offer these companies a meet your neighbor dinner, where we would bring their employees and people living in local shelters to have dinner side by side. But it was a way to build a relationship with the company on top of a relationship that already existed, right? That transaction that we had already set up in their offices. So that's the story of Knock Knock Give a Sock and how we got started.
That is a great story. And ladies and gentlemen, if you hadn't already, could tell, okay, this is why we invited Adina on the podcast today. It's just a great, I like that, interactions rather than transactions. That's something, we'll remember from our conversation today. Let me ask you this. How does Knock Knock Give a Sock operate today?
So today, Knock Knock Give Sock actually has three different pillars of our organization. So one is our sock distribution, where we distribute 500,000 pairs of socks a year, and we actually even hire people living in local shelters to help us pick up the socks and drop them off. So pick them up from different offices that are doing drives and drop them off at local shelters. So that's our sock corner. Then we have our Meet Your Neighbor events, where we have Meet Your Neighbor lunches and dinners with different corporate companies and different, nonprofit communities. We have churches and synagogues that also get involved and get engaged in wanting to have their community be a part of it. And then the third pillar is actually our 2 community events a year. One is called our Woodstock Music Festival, where we bring artists living in homes and artists living in shelters to share the stage and perform side by side, while performing for an audience filled with people living in shelters and living in homes, sitting side by side. So both the audience and the performers are connecting side by side. We even include icebreakers during intermission so that neighbors can connect during the show. And the second community event is our annual Happy Holiday Carnival, where we have a carnival for over 300 kids living in homeless shelters. And what's unique about that event is that's actually our only event a year in which we use the word volunteer, and we actively ask for volunteer. And the reason behind that is all of our other events are all just relationship building and connections, right? There is no volunteer aspect, right? There's no volunteering when you're both gaining just knowledge about who the other person is and building that relationship. And in terms of actual sock collection, right, we actually hire people living in shelters to do the pickups and drop-offs. So we don't need volunteers there. And when people are donating socks, they're donating socks. They're not volunteering, right? So this annual Happy Holiday Carnival is the only event a year in which we use the word volunteering, and that's because we're working with kids. And we actually even have people who live in shelters who are volunteering at that event as well.
That's great. So I'm curious, how has the pandemic affected your organization?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So first, I think I forgot to mention that we've been in operation for about 4 years. So I was doing this full time for 3 years before the pandemic, and I would say basically, the first year I was, living off savings and hustling to be able to get that first paycheck from running the organization. And then the second year went great. And the third year, I finally was able to hire one other person full-time and one person part-time. Things were going great. 2019 was our best year yet. We were actually even planning our first Meet Your Neighbor gala. And we had people lined up who we were going to honor. We had all the invitations written. And then come COVID, March 2020, right? I think it threw everybody for a loop. For me personally, we quickly distributed 10,000 masks thinking it would be done by Memorial Day. I was like, okay, we'll probably have to cancel our gala, but we'll be able to do everything else. And then slowly, it trickled in that this is going to be around for a while and this isn't going to be a short game. So I pretty quickly had to let go of my 2 employees And in full transparency, and I hope for any nonprofit leaders who are out there, this comes as some advice. It was really hard. I was crying myself to sleep probably 2, 3 nights a week for about 5 months. Um, and I'm very lucky. I was in a good mental health space. Like, I was engaged during that time. I got married during COVID. I was with my family. I was moved out to New Jersey. Like, my parents even had a pool in the backyard, meaning like I was in a good situation. One of my family got sick. Like, I was in a good situation for COVID. But when your baby starts, there's just nothing. You can't see any future. I didn't know. I was so in the dark about what was going to happen. And they say leaders lead in dark times, and I was like, I can't. I was having a really hard time. And I would say it was around September time where the wheels started turning again. And we finally had moved back to New York City, and my husband was super supportive. I was thinking, maybe I'll write a children's book. Nothing to do with Knock Knock Give a Sock. Why don't I write a children's book, because I'm really good at making up stories and it'll keep me busy during this time. Why don't I start taking more dance class? Like, I was really kind of thinking, okay, I just have to do things to keep me sane, because I have no idea what to do for the organization. And he really pushed me. He said, Adina, the only way you're really going to be happy is if you figure out. He's like, I don't have the answers, but like you have to push yourself to keep thinking what's next for the organization, because I don't think you're going to find happiness outside of that. And he was absolutely right. So I called up every mentor. I called up every board member, every single person who I'd spoken to over the years who had helped me grow, and kind of just was talking things out loud. And as I was talking things out loud, different things came. So basically we have three new initiatives. I would say 2 of them are just kind of adaptations, and one's a completely new pivot. So the first one is we started doing virtual Meet Your Neighbor panels. While we can't do a Meet Your Neighbor dinner, we can't get access to 25 people living in shelters to hop onto a virtual, screen like so many other companies have been able to pivot. That just doesn't exist for the shelters that we work with. But we were able to get 2 or 3 of our neighbors who have been to our events to share their stories on a virtual platform. So that's the first thing. We started doing Meet Your Neighbor panels with our existing company partners as a way to maintain our relationships and maintain relevance there. The second thing that we were able to do was every year, the big holiday carnival that we've done, we're able to do a much more scaled down version. Instead of working with all the shelters that we normally work with, we work with actually one school that we've worked with in the past where over 50% of their students live in homeless shelters, and they're all in school together every day. So in December, we did a holiday gift giveaway with Santa and elves, and we had over 200 backpacks filled with gifts that all the families came outside, and we had everything set up with a Christmas tree and decorations and music. It was a beautiful day. It even snowed a little bit, which really, we were doing it outside, so it really lent to the atmosphere. We were able to distribute those 200 backpacks with gifts. And in May, we're doing a belated holiday carnival where we're actually going to be doing part 2. Again, also with these kids who are all in the same school already, and we'll be doing it outside as well. And hopefully, according to our president, we'll all be eligible for the vaccine by May 1st. So hopefully most of our volunteers will be able to be vaccinated at that point. So those are the first 2, which I would say, again, are adaptations, right? We did the carnival every year, it just looks different. We did Meet Your Neighbor events, so it looks different. The third one, which is completely new, is basically our Pair of Books project. And what I'm doing is I'm writing 2 children's books, and we're calling it the Pair of Books project because we're selling these 2 books together, but we're selling it along with 2 pairs of socks. Let's say one for me, one for you, encouraging the young reader to find someone else to give the other pair of socks to. And what's really unique are really the storylines. So book number 1 is called Knock Knock Give a Sock. Knock Knock Give a Sock is basically me as a 5-year-old. It's about a little girl who starts collecting socks for her neighbors on the street and ends up being named the Sock Fairy. Book number 2 is about a little girl who's living in an apartment in New York City, and her family actually has to move to a family shelter. But during the move, she loses the matching pair to her lucky purple socks. So now she's like, what the heck am I going to do with one sock? She tries on as a bracelet. It's too bulky and dangly. She tries it as a bag. It's too small. Eventually, she turns it into a superhero mask. And she ends up starting a superhero club in the shelter that she's living with all the other kids. And in this superhero club, they do random acts of kindness throughout New York City. So now you have two girls in two different living situations, both making an impact in their neighborhoods. And what's unique about this book is we actually don't use the word homeless once in either of the books because the word homeless carries such a stigma with it. One talks about our neighbors on the street, and the other talks about a girl who's moving into a family shelter and speaks a little bit about what a family shelter is. But the main focus is actually that this girl who's living in a shelter is kicking butt, and making an impact in her neighborhood. And it's not about her being in a shelter. And the two distribution models we have is one, we're working with different sock companies and different book companies, and we're trying to find way to get our book out there to the general public. But the other side of it is getting our corporate partners to buy these books in bulk for families living in local shelters and building those relationships. So let's say JP Morgan were to buy 200 books for the Women in Need Family Shelter, right? We would then connect them, and then hopefully in a time when COVID is no longer lingering, we can then create family days where we bring families from the shelter and families from the office to actually have a read along of the two books together and have a family day connecting families from these different spaces. And that's what we're envisioning.
That is tremendous, and obviously, we're going to stay in touch. I was going to say we wish you all luck, but I hate when people say, don't wish me luck, help. So, we'll try to do our part. This is the kind of stuff that we're passionate about, and that's why we're talking about this. And I like the way you frame, because again, at Quintasia, we're about changing the narrative. We're about changing how Black, Indigenous, and people of color are perceived in the media, and we now want to do the same in terms of, rather than referring to people as homeless, our neighbors on the street. I like that, and to some people it might seem like, well, it's semantics, but the framing matters, the narrative matters.
And what's crazy about that? It's so easy to change the framework because I basically, like, a typical setup at a meet your neighbor dinner is, okay, so we go to Morgan Stanley offices. We have 25 of their employees, 25 people living in shelters. I basically explain, the first 10 minutes being like, welcome everybody. So why are you at a knock knock give a sock event, but you're having a dinner? And basically explain, the evolution of the organization, kind of how I spoke to you guys in the beginning. And then, and the whole time I'm talking about our neighbors. And then we have some of our neighbors actually get up and share their stories and share their journeys around homelessness. We usually have like one or two people beforehand who, have offered to share their stories. And then naturally, like, person after person just ends up getting up and sharing, and it's really powerful. But at the end of the night, I have corporate employees coming over and be like, Adina, I was talking to one neighbor and you won't believe he grew up on the same street as me in Brooklyn. Or I had one neighbor, and they are naturally saying, I was speaking to a neighbor, because we were so gently able to frame it without even telling people like, hey, this is how we speak here. You change your language and then everyone else changes their language.
Exactly. So I'm going to take a quick little break here, ladies and gentlemen, in case you did not join at the top of the podcast. We're talking today with Adina Lichtman from Knock Knock Give a Sock, and this is the Quintasia podcast. Now, for those of you who've been with us as we've rolled out our podcast, you know how we do things. It's the management team of Quintasia Studios, and we interview our guests. So coming up next now, we're going to have our CTO, Harv Lacko, who's going to continue the conversation. Harv, take it away.
Welcome, podcast viewers. It's Harv again, and this is a place for inclusivity. So it's interesting, originally I thought this wasn't a place for me. I mean, obviously you see what I look like, you see who I am. And interestingly enough, as Adina was giving her presentation, I realized that some of my unconscious bias that I have, Adina, you have no idea how specific you hit with me personally. Uh, Many years before you were born, I used to work downtown, and I used to go to Washington Square Park. And I would see the people, and in the morning when I came, I'd see them coming out of the shelters and going for the meals and the food lines. So I made it my business on Thursdays to bring a pizza. And the chess tables there, I would put the pizza there, and I was a little uncomfortable. And after a while, there was a Sam, and I would bring on Thursdays around 12:15 on Thursday. There was a pizza place right off Washington Square. The first time I went with 8 slices and it evaporated. The next time I had him do 16 slices, one pizza instead of 8 slices, 16. And I would just bring one pizza every Thursday, and I would be the pizza man. Every Thursday, the pizza man would come to Washington Square Park. And I found Sam. Sam was, I don't know his background, but Sam was the natural leader. And I would say, listen, I know pizza, New York pizza, this is my contribution. I'm doing well. I was starting out, I would give the pizza to Sam each Thursday and he would distribute it. And he would say, well, why don't you come and join us and, have your pizza on Thursday with us? And I resisted. So I didn't feel comfortable. I felt comfortable enough to make the pizza contribution, but not comfortable enough to. I'd find Sam, he'd know on Thursdays at 12:15, I'd bring the pizza. So just a thought. I mean, it's been, as I say, before you were born, it was a way to, I could have had lunch with him, but I just didn't feel comfortable. So I felt comfortable enough to contribute, but not comfortable enough to join them in the lunch. And I felt it was a very small thing. It was one pizza, it was something that they looked forward to. There was probably more mouths to feed, but it was just my way of giving something back to the community. Now, I had my own perceptions of, eating a meal and sharing a meal, but what misperceptions do you think are perpetuated by the media regarding the homeless? And what do you think the biggest difference in changing that narrative, or how would you go about we could change that narrative?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your story, and it's so real, right? And I'd even take it a step further. Humans, we've become very comfortable with the transaction, right? Like the transaction is
Absolutely. I could give the
it's
pizza.
like
I couldn't sit and have a meal.
by the way, it applies to our neighbors experiencing homelessness, but it goes a step further. Like we're so happy if someone comes in the elevator and we say, "What floor do you want us to push?" Right? But then right afterwards we look at the floor, right? We're not comfortable taking it a step further, right? We're
Right.
happy to say good morning or thank you to the bus officer, but like usually when we engage in more than like a how's the weather today, right? Then we go straight to the back of the bus because if we sit near them after that interaction, like we have to kind of move the conversation along even further. And we're uncomfortable with that. It's very easy for humans to engage in the transaction. So I think right off the bat, everything that you're saying, like it applies to our neighbors on the street, but I think it also applies to us as people. We tend to stay very comfortable in the transaction. So I would say in terms of how to take it a step further, right? How do we deal with the assumptions and the perceptions around homelessness? And I can stand up here today and tell you, street homelessness is only 5% of homelessness in New York City, and 95% of people live in shelters. I can tell you 1/3 of our neighbors, experiencing homelessness in New York City are actually children under the age of 18. At the end of the day, these numbers might affect you, but it's not going to change the way you connect with your neighbor on the street. And I would say the only way we will get comfortable changing those perceptions is by exercising that muscle, by actually engaging in these interactions. We can definitely make an impact by, for example, sharing videos on social media with our neighbors. We can definitely make a start by having our neighbors share their stories and create platforms. And there's tons of different media platforms that have started to engage in this work. And that does something. They actually think that it's only a piece of it. But there's also a second element, which actually I can send you guys a video of this afterwards, but we have a YouTube video that I made with this social media influencer about how to approach your neighbors on the street. You know, it's easy to kind of see these like high level videos where you see a guy being really nice to their neighbor on the street and maybe offering them a haircut or having a meal with them. But it's really intimidating to be that person. How do you do it? So what I do is I kind of in this video illustrate a couple rules, you know, a couple pointers, especially if it's your first time. I say, you know, the 3 situations in which we shouldn't approach our neighbor is if they're sleeping, because no one wants to be woken up, right? If they're talking to themselves because they're not talking to you, they're not engaging with you, so it's not, you know, it's not the right time, or if someone seems severely intoxicated, right? So that's like my 3 golden rules, like don't go over in those situations. But now it's like, okay, but when do you go over? So here's my, you know, the tip that people seem to like the most. Find someone with a cardboard sign for your first time approaching a neighbor. Find someone with a cardboard sign, whether it says need a train ticket or war vet, hungry, whatever it says. The point is, they're trying to tell you something. They're trying to convey a narrative and they're trying to connect and share their story with you. Meaning the cardboard sign is more than sharing their story. It's actually seeking human connection. And from there, you know, we have a couple more tips in terms of, you know, make eye contact, smile, wave. If they wave back, then go over, you know, and then get on their eye level. Make sure you're not standing while someone's sitting on the floor. Say what your name is, ask them what their name is. And that's when you kind of can engage. How's your day going? You know, what's something that you need? How can I help you? Because so often we assume that we know what they want. And the last thing that I would like to say is so often we give a sandwich and they're like, I don't like tuna fish. And we're like, well, you know,
But everybody likes pizza, right?
You can't be picky. You're on the street. Like that's
No.
our initial reaction, right? But the truth is, you know, so often we're having a bad day and we're nasty to another person. We're having a bad day and we could have been friendlier, right? For so many of our neighbors on their street, like every day is a bad day, right? And keeping that in mind and think about how many times people assume what they need. People assume what they want. I remember it was like the hottest day in the summer and I saw this one guy in the street with 8 water bottles next to him that were all filled to the top. The guy clearly didn't need another bottle of water, but no one but no one bothered to look at him. You know, they just thought hot day, someone needs a water bottle, let me buy one and put one next. But like, did they not see the other 8 water bottles next to him? Right? And I think so often we as givers, right, want to feel good. So we think, what would we want in this situation? And then we give based on that. But again, we're missing the whole story. We're missing the whole point. We're missing the whole interaction. If Diego didn't tell me, I was giving Diego sandwiches. And he was like, wait, I actually need socks. And I was like, oh my God, you're right. He's like, we wear 4 or 5 pairs of socks in the winter. It's freezing. I don't want to wear a plastic bag on my foot any longer. But here I was assuming, oh, if you're home,
you must be hungry.
Must be hungry. So yeah, I would say the way we break those perceptions is really by building relationships or by educating yourself, you know, and I think people who want their perceptions to be changed will seek ways to do it. But I think it's also such a common narrative. I speak to, and I'm going to go into Gen Z category. I speak to a lot of colleges, you know, and high schools today. And the question that I get time and time again is, what do you do if you hear someone like you're a little bit nervous being around them and like, you know, we know so many people who are homeless lie about it. And I'm like, this is the biggest misconception. Like people who are homeless must be lying about it because they have a nice pair of sneakers or they have an iPhone, right? It's like you see this guy telling their story on the subway and you're like, you have an iPhone. You're probably not actually homeless, right? And if a guy is standing and sharing their story about how they're homeless or how they're hungry and they need food, maybe they're sleeping on a friend's couch, right? Maybe they're sleeping in a car. Maybe they even have a place. But at the end of the day, this person is in need of something. And the fact that our assumption goes to, oh, they have a place to stay when none of us know that, right? But that is such a common narrative that, oh, they must be lying. I'm gonna just add on one thing, and I wasn't gonna go here, but I think it's very relevant. I'm pretty religious person, and there's in the Bible when Pharaoh has all the Israelites in his power, okay, or in his possession rather. We read this verse that it says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened, okay, before he would let the Jewish people go. There's actually only one other place in the Bible that we use the term the hardening of hearts, when God commands us to not harden our heart when it comes to charity. You're like, what? Okay, we get it. Like Pharaoh hardened his heart when it came to holding on to the Israelites, but we're going to use that term when it comes to giving charity, like telling the people not to harden their heart when it comes to giving charity. Of course, we're not going to harden our heart. But the truth is, it happens every single time we pass by someone on the street and we assume they're going to use it for alcohol. It happens when we assume that they're lying about their story. I think when it comes to our neighbors who are homeless, it's when our heart actually hardens the most when it comes to charity, and being so cognizant of that, I think, is really important.
You know, it's interesting you say that. I actually worked with someone in a professional organization, and he was not typical, I guess is the best way to describe it. And he worked in accounting, and Greg, you could probably relate to this. He was in the accounting department, and he had a normal job. And all of a sudden, one day, he was gone. And I said, "Well, what happened to Jim?" And the manager came to me and said, "You know, we saw he had all these clothes in his desk drawer. And we saw he had his toothbrush, his underwear, his deodorant, and everything. And he was actually taking a shower in like the company's bathroom. And long story short, he had no home. So he had a bank account, he had a job, and he had his clothes in his desk drawer. And he was homeless. And I never would have guessed in a million years that he was homeless. And I remember thinking at the time that, wow, that's just weird. I mean, the guy has a good job. Now I don't know what his circumstances were, but they let him go. They said, you can't live out of your desk. You need to have your own place and you can't live at work. And he was probably sleeping on couches and things like that, but he had no home. He was living out of his desk. And I was just amazed. I mean, I was just thinking, how could someone now I'm sure he was a clerk. I mean, he wasn't like he didn't have a high paying job, but he had a job. And here he was living out of his desk. I just thought that was the
By
most
the way,
bizarre thing I ever heard in my life.
my friend Will was a bank teller at Wells Fargo, and he started to develop Crohn's as he was working there. And, he didn't come from a family that had the resources to help. So, he started taking many more sick days than he was allowed, which led him to, not get paid for those days. He didn't lose his job, but he couldn't get paid as much. So he started sleeping in a homeless shelter. And he would leave the homeless shelter, go to work, and then come, go back and forth from the homeless shelter to his job. One day, one of their clients saw him leaving the shelter, reported it to the manager, and said, I'm not comfortable with him, with him managing my money. Got taken off the account, and then slowly thereafter was fired, and it was hard for him, because afterwards it's hard to get a job when you're like in and out of hospital visits. And, Crohn's, we know, is one of those really difficult diseases to live with. And, healthcare is just so expensive. It's so astronomical. But so it's interesting. I don't know what your friend Jim's story. It could have been like, he's a little bit of an eccentric personality, but it also could have been just helping pay for a family's medical bills, right? He could have been helping, maybe he had like a wife and kids that he, or an ex-wife and kids that he was supporting. There's so many different reasons why it's possible that he wasn't able to have enough money to have a place to live. And it's fascinating, right? Like, your boss saw that
I don't
situation.
know
We're
what
like,
happened to him either. That was the biggest thing. I was like, I wonder whatever happened to him.
yeah, yeah, right. And like, where does this guy go from now, right? That was
Yeah.
kind of like his last thread that he was holding on to.
Right. So Adina, how can our audience get involved? How can they get more involved in the work that you do?
So I would say any individual can, of course, donate socks to us. Go to our website, make a monetary donation as well. We'd love that. But the truth is, we love engaging communities. And we actually say individual volunteers don't really exist in our organization. But leveraging communities and networks is how we engage people who want to get involved. So whether you're part of a church community, a synagogue community, a corporate community, whatever it is, there are ways that we can engage your community, whether it's by having a virtual meet your neighbor event, having your company or community sponsor a table at one of our carnivals, having your community do a sock drive. There are ways we can engage communities. So think about what communities and networks you're a part of, and let's work together. You can sign up on our website to do a sock drive or to email us or to contact us. One thing I will say is our website is a little bit sneaky in the sense that we do have the meet your neighbor events on our website, but they're not, first,
They're not front and center. Now,
in that
what is
front
your
and center.
website? How do people find you?
It's very easy, www.kkgs.org, knockknockgivesock.org. Or you can go straight to follow us on Instagram, which is knock knock give a sock. Just straight, no numbers, no spaces, just knock knock give a sock.
Thank you so much, Adina. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, and hopefully other people like me who sort of have these unconscious biases that towards the people who are in a somewhat bad spot and need the socks and support. And it'd be good at some stage to actually maybe have the meals that your organizations and actually see that. I mean, I look back after you giving your presentation. I think, geez, what would have happened if I would have shared a lunch? I found Sam. I felt comfortable with him. I'd sort of just make the donation. They'd see me coming every Thursday at 12:15. I'd give the pizza, and then I'd just scurry off, into my comfortable world. And I don't know what Sam's story was. I don't know what Jim's story was. I guess I was a little uncomfortable in sort of pursuing that. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Greg.
Thank you. I really appreciate your question and also your stories. They're fascinating and just there's so much to learn from them. So thank you.
Well, I think we'll learn from each other, and I think Knock Knock Give a Sock and Quintasia are going to have a long and fruitful relationship together. So, Adina, pleasure, and back to you, Greg.
Thank you.
Yes, this is, to kind of wrap things up and bring this home. Um, this is what we want to be about at our company, and we think that there's a need for um, making the world a little more human, a little more humane, and by framing, or seeing from a different perspective, maybe things we pass by every day. Maybe, just maybe, we can do our part to help make this world a little bit better than the way we found it. One thing is for sure, um, hope is not a strategy. You can't sit back and hope that the world gets better. You actually have to participate and do something to try to make the world better. And that's what we hope that we will accomplish with these conversations. I will end by saying, by no means, I am very fortunate. I have been in a good situation. Like most people, I've had ups and downs. I've been an entrepreneur for over 10 years. I've had multiple ventures. Um, and, what the thing that they don't talk about when you're an entrepreneur, is the downside of failure. And sometimes that downside can be severe. And in 2018, um, I experienced, and it wasn't the first time that I experienced, the very severe downside of failure. When I say that I lost everything that I owned, it is not an exaggeration. I lost my apartment. Um, I had moved to California because I was just desperate to make something happen. I wanted to be a part of this industry, but I really couldn't figure out a way that made sense for me because I'm not, a young person out of college. I'm older, and I didn't want to start from zero again. I was like, well, but this is something I really want to do. I really feel like I have a voice, and I would like to use my voice. So I kind of tried to make things, happen, and I moved out to Burbank, and I was living in a hotel, and then I ran out of money. And I ran out of money before. I did manage to secure an interview with Disney, but in my exuberance, I wasn't thinking, this is still corporate America, and it takes forever to get hired. It's not one interview, it's multiple interviews. And by the time I did get a call back, but by the time I got, they wanted to schedule the call back, I had run out of money. So I had to call them up and tell them I couldn't go. And right then and there, I had no place. I was 3,000 miles away from my family. Um, I had no place to stay. I managed to meet some people while I was out there. I, was dealing with the Kiwanis Club because I'm a Kiwanis Club member, and I tried to hook up with the Kiwanis Club in Burbank, and they were very kind to me. Um, but there was just given the emergency need, like, okay, where's Greg going to sleep tonight? There just wasn't enough time to figure something out. And before I got to that point, before I had to move out of my hotel, I had run out of, money. So I had started going to a food pantry. And, I had never been into a food pantry in my life, had no idea how it was working. And that's when I saw, um, and I'm glad that I saw it because I would have never known. There were working, there were parents with children coming in to get help. And again, because of when you think of homelessness, you think of the guy with the long beard and the cardboard box. You don't think these are working families. These families had jobs. They were, working, and they had childcare issues, and they weren't making enough money. And that's who I saw at the food pantry. That's who was coming in for help. I will never forget that. So I'm forever changed by that experience, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing now. Is if we share our stories, if we have to bring more stories like this to light, then maybe we could help some people. And that's my goal. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I
I'd
thank
I'd
you.
actually I'd actually like to add one more piece to that, if I may, Greg.
Sure.
When I met Greg, Greg and I used to work together, and he told me about his entrepreneurial aspirations, and he said, at one point he was out in California, similar to the story he just told. But one of the things that really impressed me about Greg, I don't know what stage it was, but you told me, and this image will forever stick in my mind. You were sitting on the curb with your one suitcase, with all your worldly one suitcase. You had nothing else, just that one suitcase. You're sitting on the curb, and Greg's a big guy. If you haven't met him, or if you will, he's not a small guy. I'm not a small guy either, but and Greg said he was just thinking, okay, what do I do next? And I thought to myself, wow, I couldn't ever imagine in my life Greg sitting on a curb with one suitcase with all his worldly possessions broke, completely broke, no money, pondering his next move. And that image sort of just stuck in my mind about the character of Greg. And here we are today at Quintasia Studios with Knock Knock Give a Sock and making a difference. So, podcasters, please come back. Please get to know our community. And more than get our community, please become a part of our community. Thank you, Greg. Back to you.
And I like to say, it's definitely not about one individual. I think all of our short stories collectively is a powerful story that can be told. But it starts with you, our audience, and don't think that we take for granted you stopping by. So thanks a lot. Again, if you like this kind of stuff, if you want to support this kind of stuff, we're going to give you links to Knock Knock Give a Sock. Please subscribe to our podcast, and thanks very much for stopping by today. We have been speaking with the very wonderful and gracious Adina Lichtman from Knock Knock Give a Sock. Thanks again, everybody, and I hope you enjoy your day.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you,
Okay.
Adina.